Welcome to the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. This is a regular podcast where we'll look at the history of the First World War and travel together across the battlefields from Ypres to the Somme and beyond. So what's in this week's episode? Hi, and welcome back. It's been an amazing week with the Old Front Line podcast. We've passed 10,000 downloads. Thank you so much for all your support, for listening to the podcast, for your comments on Twitter, for your likes on Apple Podcasts and your reviews, and also for clicking onto the website oldfrontline.co.uk, which is proving a useful place to share some of the material and the photographs and the objects that I talk about in these podcasts with you on the internet. It was good to cover Gallipoli on the anniversary of the landings last weekend, but this week we return to the Somme. So let's get our boots on, charge our flask, and head down those dusty lanes of Picardy. I'm standing in what feels like a sunken lane on the outskirts of the village of Hebuterne in the northern part of the Somme battlefields. The track that I'm walking up is completely encapsulated by trees and hedgerows, which are alive with birdsong. And as I walk up this lane, I come to the imposing entrance to my first stop on this walk, Hebuterne Military Cemetery. Our walk on the Somme this week is a tale of two dugouts, and with that, a tale of two Great War veterans, Harry Coates and Malcolm Vyvyan. But before we get to them, and where those dugouts were, we are starting here at Hebuterne Military Cemetery. The village of Hebuterne is not actually in the department of the Somme, it's in the Pas-de-Calais, the next county, the département, up, if you like, from the Somme area. It witnessed a clash between French and German forces here in 1914 and some heavy fighting in June of 1915. And that summer the first British troops began to arrive in this sector, men from the 48th South Midland Division. They were a Midland Territorial Division made up of battalions recruited in that area, Saturday night soldiers who had been mobilised on the outbreak of war, sent first to Flanders, where they'd occupied the trenches along the Messines Ridge, and then moved down to the Somme in that summer of 1915. It was they who started the British plot of this cemetery in July of 1915, when they began to add graves to a burial site already begun by French soldiers, where they'd buried their comrades, the poilus, who had died here in those battles of 1914 and 1915. Those graves have subsequently been removed to French cemeteries or to local cemeteries elsewhere in France. To get into the cemetery, we go through the large bronze gates and up the steps and along a grass path through quite a substantial archway shelter. And this leads us into plot 1 of the British Cemetery, the original plot of Hebuterne Military Cemetery itself. And it was here those men of the 48th South Midland Division, regiments like the Oxenbucks, Light Infantry, the Worcesters, the Gloucesters, the Royal Warwicks and the Royal Berkshires, all buried their dead from the day-to-day activities of trench warfare in this sector when they first arrived, and up to when a new division arrived here, also a territorial division, men from the 56 Londons. So in plot 1, these are not men killed in the great battles of the First World War. These are those soldiers who died in the day-to-day activities of just holding the line. Snipers, bombardments, rifle grenades, trench mortars, even gas attacks, which were becoming more and more commonplace as gas became one of the predominant weapons of the First World War. This is a cemetery that is largely in date order. Those original graves laid out before us in plot 1 lie side by side with plot 2, 3 and 4 to our right. And as we move into those different plots, we see the dates gradually beginning to change, leading up to that crescendo of the 1st of July 1916. There is a mass burial in plot 4, row M of the cemetery, where men from the 56th London Division, those London territorials killed in the act of going over the top from the assembly trenches just outside the village of Hebuterne, their bodies were recovered after the battle and brought back here for burial. But who were the 56th London Division? A division consists of nearly 20,000 men, and this one had been formed before the war. Saturday night soldiers from in and around London. Regiments like the Queen Victoria Rifles, the Queen's Westminster Rifles, the Kensingtons, the Rangers, they were all part of this division, as well as the London Scottish, who are particularly well represented by the burials in this cemetery. The division represented London in so many different ways, including its class structure. The Fusilier battalions of this division were largely working class, and there were middle class units like the Rangers and the QVRs, the Queen Victoria Rifles and the Queen's Westminsters, and some battalions like the London Scottish that you could almost describe as upper class. To join the London Scottish before the war, you not only had to either be Scottish or of Scottish descent, you had to pay to join. A figure of something like £10 was the joining fee, which didn't go in the pocket of the commanding officer. It went towards equipping and running the battalion. It was also a battalion that had signed up almost universally for Imperial Service before the war. And this was an obligation that was brought in so that the War Office could mobilise these part-time soldiers for overseas service if a war broke out. Not specifically for the battlefield, but perhaps to go to some of the far-flung corners of the Empire, to places like Malta and Gibraltar, and relieve regular units that were there so that they could come to wherever the battle was being fought. But in the case of the London Scottish, they were so well equipped and at such high strength, almost full bayonet strength, they were sent to France almost immediately just after the outbreak of the war in September of 1914 and became the first territorial infantry battalion to see action at Messines on the 31st of October 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres. The cemetery contains 761 burials from the First World War. The vast majority of them, all but 40 odd, are known soldiers. So this gives us quite a good cross-section of the different units and the types of men that came to fight in this northern part of the Somme sector in 1915 when we first arrived, right through to the battles of 1916, and then when the fighting returned here in the spring and summer of 1918, you can find burials from that period of the conflict as well. There was also a number of American burials once in this cemetery. Doughboys from the American Expeditionary Force attached to the British Army on the Somme in that 1918 offensive. Their graves were either removed to the American cemetery at Boney on the Somme, or were those that were repatriated back to the United States after the conflict was over. Something like 60% of America's war dead were returned home after World War I. Leaving the cemetery by the main gate, we turn left down that tree and hedgerow-lined path to where it meets a road on the edge of Hebuterne village. And here we turn left again to go into the heart of the village itself. Hebuterne, like all of the villages in this Somme battlefield area, did not really survive the war. It was part of that red zone, Zone Rouge, an area of almost total destruction. So when we look at these houses and farms around us, these are all rebuilt from the 1920s or later. There's an excellent book by a soldier of the 1st 7th Royal Warwicks from that South Midland Division who was here in the summer of 1915, The Fateful Battle Line by Henry Ogle, and he describes what life was like at that time in the village of Hebuterne. We set up our headquarters in the southeastern part of the village, where a wet trench passed through and under the remains of a row of small single-storied cottages. All but one were in ruins, and that one was over the trench, so that it was somewhat incomplete as a dwelling. It had one habitable room because by some freak of circumstance its roof was unbroken. We bridged the trench with a door and stepped into the room through a hole in the wall. In the room we found a broken chest of drawers, a broken chair, a bucket, bottomless, or it would not have been there, a large wooden box, a straw bee-skep or hive, many empty bottles and some straw. John put a drawer upside down over the beehive, stuffed straw into the chair seat, made a drawing board from the bottom of another drawer, stuck a candle in a bottle, draped some ancient rags over the enemy-facing window, and there was his office, set up. My box made me a desk, and both of us a dining table. The upturned bucket and some straw a seat, and our bed was the straw, tolerably clean and dry, covered with our ground sheets. Continuing down this road, we come into the very heart of the village of Hebuterne. There's a large village green here, which probably in centuries past was host to markets and fairs. But during the Great War, the Germans realised that it was a route up to the front line, and they regularly bombarded it. And that's how it got its name Shell Green to the troops that were here during the First World War. It's at this point that we introduce the first of our Great War veterans in this week's episode, Malcolm Vyvyan. I came to know Malcolm after he responded to an advert I placed in Stand 2, the Journal of the Western Front Association, back in the mid-1980s. I'd been asking for information about the Royal Garrison Artillery, and he responded with the news that he'd been a forward observation officer with the 96th Siege Battery Royal Garrison Artillery on the Western Front from 1916. We became good friends, and letter after letter came from him in the post, incredibly detailed accounts of what he'd gone through in the trenches of the Western Front. I went to visit him at his house in Saltash on many occasions, and he left a huge legacy of what his war had all been about. In one of the letters he described an incident here at this Shell Green on the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And this is his account. The trench system started just by Hebuterne Church, which as I left the trenches on the night of the 1st of July, after 6 days in the observation post, was blazing fiercely. An infantry corporal held battalion roll call. 17 privates answered. Of course, a lot more drifted back later. A London Rifle Brigade private was building a fire to heat a cup of tea. A shell burst beside him. He would never drink that tea. And then another London Rifle Brigade man asked if I'd seen a private about. His brother. Was it the man I'd seen killed? Malcolm came from a very privileged background. The Vyvyans were the oldest Cornish family. He'd been privately educated and then had gone on to Cambridge University, from where he joined the army in 1914. His father was a wealthy businessman and his mother was American, and he had 2 brothers in the war with him, one a gunner officer like him who died in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, and another was an officer in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry who served right through the war and was gassed and awarded the Military Cross. But this account we've heard of the night of the 1st of July was after his time in the dugout opposite Gommecourt, and we'll come to that again later on. Meanwhile, we'll head north out of the village in the direction of the next village, Fonquevilliers, or Funky Villas as the troops called it, and this will take us out into the countryside with the wide open fields around us, across to our right, over towards the woods of Gommecourt Park, and beyond that Gommecourt Wood itself. This was the killing ground of the territorials on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And as we continue, we reach a wayside shrine in an area of some small trees on the right-hand side. And here we'll stop and go through a little gate that will take us to a concrete bunker we can see out on the edge of the pasture where it meets the fields. The large concrete observation post bunker that's here does not date from the 1916 Battle of the Somme. I'll put a picture up on the Old Frontline podcast website so you can see what it looks like. This bunker dates from 1918 and was built by either the Royal Engineers of the 42nd East Lancashire Division or by New Zealand engineers who were here during that earlier period of the summer. But it sits on the old front line of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And there were two dugouts here that feature in this week's story. One, a forward observation officer's dugout, where Malcolm Vyvyan was, and another, a headquarters dugout, where there was also an observation post, was where Harry Coates was with some of the brigade staff in the London Division on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Forward observation officers were known as FOOs or FOOs, and they manned observation posts, or OPs, or even OPIPs as they were called in Army signalling phonetics of the time. And their life expectancy on the Western Front was short because they were always well forward of the guns, spotting for those guns and targets for German counter-artillery to try and wipe out the eyes of the guns, forward observers like them. And it was in an OP, somewhere to the left of where this bunker now stands, that Malcolm Vyvyan found himself in the 6 days leading up to the Battle of the Somme. When I went to go and see him, he had his original trench map that he'd used in this dugout, still covered with Somme mud, and on it were marked the lines of fire of his 9.2-inch howitzers from 96 Siege Battery. Their targets were to the south of Gommecourt village, on the edge of Gommecourt Park, and around a wood called Rossignol Wood or Nightingale Wood. On one of my trips to the Somme in the late 1980s, thanks to the mayor of Gommecourt, I got access to Rossignol Wood, and I found in there some of the 9.2-inch shell craters, which almost certainly were the result of fire directed by Malcolm Vyvyan from this observation post in 1916. And I took some photographs and drew a little sketch and sent it to Malcolm, and he found it incredible that evidence of his war, shell craters caused by the explosion of shells from his guns, were still there after all those decades. And I'm pleased to say they remain there still. When you stand here, you can see what an advantage point that this is. You can see why observation posts were constructed here, because ahead of you is the vast mass of Gommecourt Park. Part of the wood comes out as a promontory towards where you're standing. In 1916, there was a single oak tree there. There are oak trees there today, but not a single one, sadly. And this one was known to the troops who were here at that time as the Kaiser's Oak. And it roughly located the dividing line between the 56th London Division attack on the right and the 46th North Midland Division attack on the left. And from this dugout, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, Malcolm very sadly had to watch the destruction of both of these divisions in the attack on Gommecourt, something that he never forgot. And this, in conjunction with the destruction of the Hull POWs that he witnessed at Serres on the 13th of November 1916, led to an incident the following year when his gun battery came under fire. It looked as if the guns would be knocked out by German long-range artillery fire, and he rushed out in the midst of the bursting shells and saved the guns from destruction, for which he was awarded the Military Cross. And he said to me several times that the inspiration for him doing that was not any sense of bravery on his part, but the remembrance of the death of so many Tommies here at Gommecourt and Hull POWs at Serres, and he was determined that if at all possible, he would do anything to prevent that from happening again. And a year later, in the summer of 1917, he was able to do that by saving his guns and supporting the attack of the Canadians at Hill 70. But this wasn't his abiding memory of the dugout and the observation post opposite Gommecourt. It was an incident in the lead-up to the 1st of July, when one day another gunner officer came knocking on their dugout door. And this is his account of it. One day, a Royal Field Artillery lieutenant stumbled into our OP dugout, very much the worse for wear, and said his OP had been blown in and the major and telephonist buried. We gave him a mammoth whisky in the usual chipped enamelled mug, and Sergeant Parsons and myself went along the trench with him. One look at the front of the dugout told us there was no help there. It was completely sealed with heavy timbers. The Royal Field Artillery Lieutenant said there was an emergency shaft opening into the open near our wire. So there was, and a few feet down the shaft was bisected by a sheet of corrugated iron, jammed tight, and on one side was a gunner struck unconscious. Being young and thin and tall, I was able to wriggle head first into the shaft and get my hands under his armpits. The others, helped by 2 infantrymen, pulled my legs, and eventually he shot out like a cork from a bottle, very shell-shocked. We put him on the fire step. Another man came up, but he was big and heavy and I couldn't move him. Eventually a medical officer came up and said he was dead. The groans of the others trapped there had now ceased, so sadly we gave up. By this time other men from the Royal Field Artillery Battery had arrived, so we left them to it. One remarkable thing was the Germans hadn't machine gunned us. I expect our barrage had made them keep their heads down. So that was Malcolm's experiences opposite Gommecourt in the early stage of the Battle of the Somme. What about Harry Coates? Harry served with the London Scottish and then on the staff of his brigade headquarters. I came to know him as one of his sons lived in a village not far from where my parents were, and he travelled around various sons, and I used to go and see him as and when I could. As with Malcolm, he became a very good friend, and I learnt so much about the British Army in the First World War and the battles in which he'd taken place from him. Being on brigade headquarters for most of the war, he was privileged to a lot more information than most ordinary soldiers. But how did he get to that point? He joined the London Scottish on the outbreak of the war in the 2nd Battalion and had served with them in Surrey before being transferred as a reinforcement draft to the 1st Battalion in France, who'd been out there since September of 1914. He went over the top in the Battle of Loos in September 1915 and was gassed. He witnessed his best mate being killed alongside him. He could always remember the cold, dead eyes staring out of the gas mask eyepieces at him as he went to see if his mate was all right and realised that he was dead. Harry took a lot of gas in that attack, and he was never really quite the same again, although he lived to a great age. And after having recovered from being gassed at Loos at a base hospital, he returned really too early to the battalion, and his commanding officer took pity on him. He knew that Harry had attended before the war a pitman shorthand and typing course and was proficient in both. So an ideal post for him was at brigade headquarters, and he went there in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme in the late spring of 1916. At Gommecourt, Harry was Brigade Orderly Sergeant to the Brigadier, Brigadier General Edward Locke, commanding the 168th Infantry Brigade, part of the 56th London Division. This unit was comprised of 4 infantry battalions: the 1st 4th London Regiment, the Royal Fusiliers, the 1st 12th London Regiment, the Rangers, the 1st 13th, the Kensingtons, and the London Scottish, in which Harry had originally served. And in the lead up to the 1st of July, they entered a dugout specially prepared for them by their brigade major, Major Philip Neame VC. He'd been awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery as a Royal Engineer officer in the fighting at Neuve-Chapelle in 1914. And together their task was to observe the brigade's attack on the southern part of Gommecourt on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Harry always remembered that they had a grandstand view of it. They watched the men go over the top, they heard the whistles blow. Smoke had been laid in front of the attacking battalions, and the lines of infantry disappeared into that smoke and quickly also disappeared in the face of relentless German artillery and machine gun fire. The brigadier had to stand there and watch his proud brigade, its first time in action, be annihilated before his very eyes. It was something that broke him, quite literally broke him. We tend to think that generals die in bed and they spend most of their war miles behind the lines. But here was a brigadier general watching the men that he'd seen trained, that he'd seen get ready for this offensive disappear into the gun smoke forever. And it destroyed him. Philip Neame sensed what had happened to their brigadier, and as the 1st of July drew to a close and the evidence of the destruction of that brigade became apparent, he ordered Harry to escort the brigadier to the rear to get him off the battlefield. And this is Harry's description of that event. He was like a man in a dream. It was terrible to see him like that, because he was quite a chatty old boy, always talking about his little daughter, and friendly, though he could be severe sometimes. The old man was a daredevil, a real fighter. He wanted to be in strict control of all that was going on, and that's why we had this magnificent dugout with the short trench above it, away in advance of the battalion headquarters. It saved all our lives. If it hadn't been for this deep dugout, we'd have all been killed or buried alive. They were simply knocking hell out of us nearly all day. I'm sure the old man was shell-shocked. I know I was. He was broken. He made no objection to coming with me. He didn't say a word. He just got up very, very slowly, and in a break in the shelling, we went out. They'd shelled our own trenches so much that the line was absolutely broken, and the trenches were all knocked in and chaps buried underneath. We were treading over dead bodies and all sorts of things going along. We just struggled back as best as we could, past men going forward to try and get the wounded out of the trenches and out of no man's land, and past people going up to reinforce the front line, what was left of it. There was hardly anyone there. The brigadier just followed me, and eventually we managed to get through onto the road to Saley-aux-Bois. Harry never forgot that day at Gommecourt, and his brigade major, Philip Neame, survived the war like him, and they stayed in touch for the rest of their lives. Neame remained in the regular army, and in 1924 he won a gold medal at the Olympics. In the Second World War he was captured in the Western Desert and escaped from an Italian prisoner of war camp. A remarkable man. The letters that Harry had from him always began, "Dear Coates," never "Dear Harry." They were different men then. And I know I often say it about these great war veterans that I was so privileged to know, but Harry was quite remarkable. In 1985 I invited him down to the Sussex branch of the Western Front Association on the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Loos, and he stood up for nearly 2 hours and gave us an incredible presentation of what it was like to be there as an infantry soldier in 1915. I miss those days, and I miss the company of men like Harry and Malcolm, but it's good to be able to share some of their memories of battlefields like Gommecourt and Hebuterne with you via the old front line. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And I've got two in front of me now, one a badge and one a postcard. And earlier in the podcast I was talking about how some of the London battalions being sent overseas very early in the war had been able to do that because their personnel, the men within that battalion, had signed the Imperial Service obligation. And the badge is the Imperial Service Badge that you were given when you signed this obligation. The badge was instituted in 1910, and the idea behind it was to encourage territorial force, as it was called then, territorial army later on, but territorial force men to sign up for this so that in time of war they could be sent overseas outside of the borders of Great Britain. And the War Office's reasoning behind this was to use these territorials to go overseas to the far-flung corners of the empire and to places like Malta and Gibraltar and Bermuda to relieve units of the regular army so that they could be dispatched to the front wherever that was. Now, in some units of the territorial force, which itself had been formed out of the volunteers in April 1908, the take-up was very low. By 1913, I think it was something like 7% of the territorial force had signed up for this. But in certain battalions, in certain regiments of the territorial force, London Regiment being a good example of it, the take-up rate was quite high. Several battalions making it actually policy within the unit for every man to have signed the obligation and received this badge. So when we see photographs of men wearing it, and that's the other object, is a postcard of a man from the Bedfordshire Regiment, probably the 1st 5th Battalion, actually wearing one of these badges above his right tunic pocket. And when we have a postcard like this and we see one of our ancestors wearing this badge, it gives us an indication that they are a member of the territorial force, a battalion or unit of the territorial force that had signed up for this obligation before the war. Territorials joined for 4 years, periods of 4 years, and they did regular sessions at a local drill hall. Territorial battalions before the war had 8 companies, normally locally recruited, so in many ways some of these territorial battalions were the original POWs, being tied to a local community or an area in which they recruited. And you were obliged to go along to the local drill hall for sessions with other members of your company, and once a year the whole battalion, the whole unit would get together for an annual camp. So this badge, as rare as it was in some corners of the British Army in 1914, was seen as a bit of a mark of distinction, and the veterans that I interviewed in the 1980s who were holders of the Imperial Service Badge were very proud of the fact that they had it and had put their lives on the line before the war had even broken out to serve Britain overseas. So it's another one of these little objects that connects us to the First World War and that tells us not just about a particular soldier or a regiment, but the wider aspect of how the army operated, how it recruited, and how it served from the very beginning of the conflict. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. I hope you found this week's content of interest. Do take time to subscribe to the podcast. Follow me on Twitter @SommeCorps and tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Until next week, when our paths cross again on the battlefields of the Great War.